Hi. Let's see, Judy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Okay.
Hello.
I think I was on mute before. I apologize. All right. So we're just talking about this this part of the Talmud, and I'll put it up on the screen. So what we're talking about is we have three kinds of people that God proclaims their goodness on a daily basis, right? That's how good they are. They're so good that God is proclaiming their greatness every day. Right? And one of them is the person who lives in a city, a bachelor, right, who lives in a city but does not sin with women. And it's not women, right? Here probably it's probably prostitutes, right? About a bachelor who lives in a city. Oh, I said that one. About a poor person who returns a lost object to his owner, right? And then finally about a wealthy person who, and you'll see this on the next page, excuse me, who tithes his produce in private without publicizing his behavior. All right, so what the trick we're trying to do here is to figure out, well, what brings these three categories together? Why is Rabbi Yochanan saying that these are a category? Right? What makes them a category, as opposed to just three random things?
Well, the only thing I can see that might make them one category is that they don't publicize their good works.
There we go. Okay, so that's one really possible answer, right? So speaking of publicizing the good works, let's look at let's look at the last one, right? So does everyone know what tithing is? Do you know what tithing is, Hetty? No. Okay, so tithing, right, is the practice of setting aside 10% of your produce, right, to give to the poor, right? And so in that or to support the or like it's like taxes basically, right? So the idea is, right, that and there still are many communities today that tithe, right, where the idea is that as a member of a church or a synagogue or a mosque or whatever it is, right, that you'll give 10% of your of however you determine it, 10% of your proceeds you will give to the church or the synagogue to support its programs, to support especially if they have a lot of outreach to poor people, right? A lot of churches do a lot of outreach to people who are poor, right? So very often giving to the church means that you're giving to poor people. It doesn't always mean that you're building the Crystal Cathedral or paying for the expensive suits that the pastor wears, right? So a tithe, right, is a very important aspect, right? So why might a person tithe publicly?
To let people know how good he is. Yeah. Religiously.
Right. So we have many examples of that, right? And in a certain sense, thank God, right, that we have many examples of that, right? We have, Dennis, right, who's provided funding to support HSL and has the naming rights to this building, right? We have whoever Cohen was back in the day. We have Goldman, right? And Goldman didn't just give money and have his name on the building. He has a big party for everybody who lives at 50 Beacon Street every year, and he and his family come. So thank God, right, that there are people who not only give, right, but give in this kind of public way, right? Because that is so. And again, I want to point out, right, that and I think that's what's interesting about this. One of the things that's interesting about this, right, is that there's something disreputable, right, about it's according to the Talmud, right, about people who, who live in the city and sleep with harlots, right? There's something, something not so great, right, about a guy who finds money and doesn't return it, right? And there's something not so great about making a big deal of the fact that you're a rich guy and can, and can sort of fund things, and you want people to know how good you are, right? And on the other hand, right, none of these things is a complete deal killer somehow, right? Right? Like it's, you can tithe publicly. It's not the end of the world, right? Hey, hi, Mark. And I wonder, like, it certainly would not be ideal to be a poor person who finds money and doesn't return it, but we might understand it, right? We might be able to understand, right? And if you're a bachelor, right, which you're not supposed to be a bachelor, right, in the Jewish tradition, right, for a number of reasons, right? But if you're a bachelor, it might be understandable, right, that you visit the what do they call it? But there's a nicer word for it.
Women of the night.
Women of the night, right? That you be frequent prostitutes, right? Because the Talmud is very open about this, right? The Talmud is very open, right? That sex is a part of life, and that one of the reasons that a Jewish man is supposed to be married, right, is because you are supposed to be able to have a full experience of life, which includes sexual experiences, right? That's part of life, so you should be able to have them, right? So it might be understandable if you don't have a wife that you find other outlets, right, for that. So again, I don't think the Talmud here is saying that any of these things is not a sin, right? But I think what they're saying is these are sort of, as sins go, these might be, we can sort of understand, right, why people might do that. Now, why might we understand them? What links these three things to make them sort of understandable as sins that a person might commit?
There's a good side, there's a bad side.
Right. Yeah, right. There's a good side to the bad side. I love that. Right? Is that it is a sin not to return a lost object. And if a poor person finds a lost object and can sell it for money, he has resources to support his family. Right? So it's a bad thing, but there's a good side. Right? It's obviously a sin to frequent a prostitute. Right? On the other hand, right? It's nature, right? A person has the need, right, to have sexual experiences. So that's just part of the way it goes in the world, right? And the final one too is that people are a little vain, right? Especially rich people, right? If they have a lot of money, they like everybody to know how rich they are, right? Not all rich people, right? But it's not uncommon, seems to be saying the Talmud, right? Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
On the topic comes right to mind a story I learned earlier in life about the man who bought a camel. Maybe you remember this anecdote. It's in the literature about. And then the man discovers a jewel in the camel's neck, or in the camel. Returns the jewel to the owner from who got the camel. And the anecdote is that it was the man is blessed as a Jew, as a person of Jewish faith, for doing this because the other man was not of any particular background and so forth, so that he would in effect was blessing the God of the man, Hashem, of the man who returned the jewel.
Right.
This was a story. It's in the literature. I be that the blessing is a blessing, and because it recognizes God.
Right.
And therefore, it's not just a matter of saying, hey, you're a good guy, you turned up. It's more than that. It's a blessing. It goes right back to the maker.
Yeah. Well, I love that more. I think that's really, really astute, because in addition to there's sort of a good to the bad, right? It's also, right, that good, right, is only somehow overcome, so to speak, right, by, I think what Maury is suggesting, and maybe Rabbi Yochanan has this in mind, right, that if you remember God, right, it's, like you may, and I mean, I'll just give away what my thought is about this, right, is that these three things are about temptation, right, about serious temptations, right, in our worlds, right, and understandable temptations, right, sex, right, money, and sort of fame or renown, right, are things that I think as humans, right, we often make bad choices about these things, right? It's not uncommon for people to make, just maybe value them more than we might, or value them more than we should, right? And it's also interesting, right, that these are things that, at least in the first two, right, talking about sex and talking about money, right, very often these are kind of taboo subjects for us, right? We don't like to talk about these things, right? Because, it's a little, we maybe feel a little shame about it. We feel a little inadequate about it, right? We don't have enough money, right? Or we just don't talk about sex in polite society, whatever it is, right? And so they become kind of topics that we don't talk about. So very interesting here, right? That God's going to talk about it, right? God's going to proclaim somehow the greatness of these people who can overcome these temptations. Now, of course, there's the question: are these temptations really worth overcoming, and why? Obviously, a lot of traditional moralities, right, will say that these are things, that you should be sexually modest, you should be honest with, you should not steal at all, right, and you should be humble, right, and so, and these are major temptations, right, and so the person who can withstand them, right, is any reactions, thoughts about this? So do you still think that Rabbi Yochanan has missed the mark and strapped together disparate topics? I mean,
It's hard, really, it is hard to say.
Yeah.
You will never know. Like the poor person, he had nothing, so he said, he thinks, I don't got nothing. Then when he could find a person who lost it, when he can, he keep it, but he trying to say, I live without it, I can live without it for again.
Yeah. All right, so yeah, go ahead.
Well, I feel, and this is very personal feeling, that the highest ethic is towards another person. Okay, so it makes me think that the second person, the poor person, if he doesn't return someone else's property, it's harming another person.
Yeah.
And the other cases, I don't see them as harming this specific.
Right. So that's very, I think that's a very important point, a very interesting point, right? And to think about, well, is there a way, right? How can we see, right, if there is other directed harm, at the in the other two, right? Which is an interesting question, right? Is giving in to the temptation of sleeping with a prostitute, right? Does that really harm anybody? That's a good question, right? Does it really harm anybody? I mean, you could even make the argument, I'm not sure that I would, right, is that sex workers need to eat too, right? So if you don't go to them for sex work, they won't, On the other hand, you could make the argument that if people weren't going to sex workers for sex, right, that sex workers would do something else, right? I don't know. It's an interesting question, right? So that one, but I do think that the story of Rav Safra that we'll get to in just a moment, I do think that story addresses that concern a little bit. So we'll get to that one. The other one is a little harder for me to come up with off the top of my head, right? Is there any active harm to other people, right, of the bigwig? I just got finished talking about how, it's great actually that we have people who are willing to do this, right? Because, our nonprofit organizations would have a lot fewer resources, right? If we didn't have people who are willing to stand up and accept the award, right? Right.
Well, to contradict myself, there could conceivably be people who feel badly because they too couldn't contribute.
That's right. So you put that very nicely, and I was trying to figure out a way of saying that basically, right, that by putting yourself up, you are essentially putting other people down, right? And so the psychological effect, right, of putting all the attention and praise on this one person, right, whereas it's really a complete community effort, right, undermines the sort of that spirit of community that's so important, right? So yeah, so I can see yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Well, it just comes to mind about the levels of giving.
Right, exactly, right. So Maimonides has right this ladder of tzedakah, right, which I'm sure we could pull up in a minute, in a second if you want. But maybe I'll do that. But Marjorie, why don't you say what you want to say? Nothing.
I would be giving up people. You could see his last names on the front part of colleges
Yes.
and hospitals all the time.
100%. 100%. Right. It's you get in every elevator in the hospital has somebody's name on it, right? Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah. So I mean, and I mean, I think we as a society have sort of made our peace a little bit with that. And I think, and I often wonder, right, is there something that is corrosive of our culture, right, that we rely so much on private philanthropy in our world, right, that we have to sort of really lionize the people who give the most money, right? Is there something corrosive about that for us? And I don't know the answer, right? My guess is that the example of healthcare, I think, is really important, right? In many other countries, right, healthcare is taken care of by the government, right? So they don't need, right, necessarily to have massive capital campaigns to put people's names on every elevator getting up to every floor. Right. I mean, even poor Maimonides, right? I mean, poor Maimonides is now the name of a medical center, right? In Haifa, poor guy. And he thought he thought of himself as, quite the guy. Ladder of tzedakah. Okay.
One question.
Yeah.
When you make it personal, like the sentence personalized for us with Maimonides, I think that way for a second on my own thoughts. I say, what's the process of thinking further about that? when Maimonides thinks, as Jim has already taught, to come up with his designations.
Yeah.
What went into his thinking.
Right.
So for that, then I make a comparison in my own mind as to whether or not the thinking I have fits somewhat into how he formed up his.
Right.
And in that respect, I think he doesn't want to drift too far from the moral integrity he has, I'll put it that way.
Right.
So that we don't get distracted.
Yeah. I mean, Maimonides is a really interesting case for a whole bunch of reasons, right? Not least of all that, you know, he is someone who, on one hand, sort of represents the rabbinic tradition. On the other hand, he kind of rejects the rabbinic tradition, right? Because in Maimonides' view, there's an answer, right? There's one answer. There is one ladder of tzedakah, right? That he is going to lay out for us. Very convenient, right? For those of us who either don't have the time or the inclination to wrestle, right, with all the random pieces of the Talmud that are scattered all over the corpus, right? Talking about the guy with the camel, talking about the guy with the tithes over here, and this one over there, and the guy who gave grudgingly, and it's the Talmud isn't put together that way. Maimonides thought it should be, right? So what does he call it? He calls his law code the Mishnah Torah, right? The repetition of the Torah. And this is the only book you need. You just need Maimonides and you know everything you need to know, right? So Maimonides is, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Maimonides' work because it's very, very smart, it's very, very clear, right? But it's not exactly rabbinic, right? Because Maimonides cites, whom does he cite? He cites Maimonides. So, all right, so here is Maimonides' 8 levels of tzedakah. All right, give me a second, we'll just put it over here a little bit so you can see it. Hold on one moment. Okay, all right, so in ascending order, okay, so you give tzedakah, right? But you give it grudgingly. Right? When one gives less than he should, but he does it happily. Maybe he's happy because he figures he's getting away with something, right? When one gives directly to the poor upon being asked, right? So you're walking down the street, someone asks for money, and you give it to them, right? This is presumably in a culture, right, where there's more of a culture of begging for food, right? Whereas today, many people who are out on the street, right, we don't know what is it that what do they want to use the money for, right? There's a lot of question about that, right? I don't know if it's legitimate questions or not, but there's questions. When one gives directly to the poor without being asked, right? So you're just walking down the street and handing out money. Right? Donations when the recipient is aware of the donor's identity, but the donor still doesn't know the specific identity of the recipient. All right, so that's already different, right? So that would be one, right, where you give to an organization, right, and the organization distributes the poor and says, "This came from Phyllis." Right? When you see Phyllis, thank her because she gave this money. All right. Donations when the donor is aware to whom the charity is being given, but the recipient is unaware of the source. Which I actually find this one, it's an interesting one, right? In these cases, right, there's this kind of power imbalance, right? Like I know that, I know, and Hedwig knows, right, that Hedwig's money is helping Phyllis, but Phyllis just knows that someone is helping her, right? Right. That's it. I think in general, it's not always an ideal situation. So I'm not sure that I would put this one above number 4, right? I'm just not sure. All right. Giving assistance in such a way that the giver and the recipient are unknown to each other. Communal funds administered by responsible people are also in this category. Okay, so you give the Federation, and Federation gives to people who need it. Right? There's a big, I mean, everybody in the room, right, gives money to Federation, right? And Rabbi Baker at CJP decides who gets what. I mean, he doesn't, but let's just pretend. Right? He decides who gets it, right? And so it comes from Federation, right? Which means it comes generally from the community, right? That's kind of the ideal situation. But that's only number 2. Do you have a question? No. Okay. But the highest form of charity, right, or tzedakah, right, is to help sustain a person before they become impoverished by offering a substantial gift in a dignified manner, or by extending a suitable loan, or by helping them find employment or establish themselves in business so as to make it unnecessary for them to become dependent on others, right? So in a certain sense, right, and it's so interesting, right, that they say that this is charity, right, because this is the way in which tzedakah really is distinct from charity, right? Tzedakah is, tzedakah, the word comes from justice, right, from tzedek, right? So it's a way of achieving justice in society, right? Whereas charity comes from the Latin, right, caritas. It comes from caring about other people. Not to say that charity is bad, right? It's just it's a different mode of interacting, and in a sense, right, all of the versions 2 through 8, right, in a sense, there's no substantial difference necessary between tzedakah and charity, right? But the bottom one, right, number 1, right, there is some of a difference, right? Go ahead, Murray.
Well, splitting hairs a little bit, okay? I would say that the Jewish version is superior in most things, only because it comes from God, from the source of love.
Yeah, right.
And caring is just, okay, some of us are born with a more instinctive human instinct and so forth. But Judaism precedes that with the mandate from everybody, the requirements that I give them as a condition of life.
Right. And we have in the Bible, right? We have in the book of Deuteronomy, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, right? That justice you shall pursue, right? And how do you pursue justice, right? You pursue justice by making sure everyone has equal opportunity, right? Has the basic needs are met, so on and so forth, right? It's one of the things that our particular society where we live in the United States is not so good at, right? We by and large don't ensure that everyone has the basics of what they need. We do better than many other countries think we do at it, right? But it's very tough here, right? It's very tough, for people to live if they're so worried about medical care all the time.
And that follows through seemingly philosophically the Bible. The guy was talking to somebody in Arizona, and they had their first 100-degree day.
Right.
I said, you don't, I was thinking about Israel, with water and everything. And some.
Yeah.
In Arizona, I said to this person, I said, I made a statement that about how Arizona doesn't have that. So it's a 100-degree day and they want to have air conditioning. Why?
Yeah.
It's not going to be humanized in Arizona like it is in Israel. Amongst the thinkers and doers.
Yeah.
In one culture versus another. Necessarily.
Yeah.
That's not a given.
Right. And it's very, Israel is where I think of, right? Not that Israel is, paragon, obviously, but I think of it because I used to work for Federation, and I ran a program called Shiluvim, which was focused on empowering the Ethiopian Israelis in Haifa. And it was such an interesting situation where we had a donor who wanted to give money for entrepreneurship classes. And our Ethiopian Israeli partners in Haifa said, "Oi, our people, the Ethiopian Israelis, they're not an entrepreneurial people. They're not, we're not going to, it's really not a great use of resources. but the donor was insistent, right, that this was going to happen. And he's a very powerful, very irascible guy, right? So there was no talking him out of it. And so we ran these classes, and within a year, there were 15 or 20, I forget what it was, 15 or 20 Ethiopian Israeli owned new businesses in Haifa, thanks to this guy, right? And it was exactly number one, right? What do? You help them find employment or establish themselves in business, right? These guys all, I mean, not that every one of these businesses thrived and continued and whatever, blah, 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 but it was remarkable to me where the people on the ground were like, it'll never happen. And on the contrary, right, as soon as you presented these folks with an opportunity to learn about business and making a business plan and this, that, and the other thing, whoa, lo and behold, we have this real success. So this is something that's really true. So, all right, we got off on this topic. Oh, because we were talking about how is there a harm that comes from publicizing your own tithing or your own philanthropy? And it's a good. I think it's a complicated question. I think in the time of the Talmud, right, clearly they saw it as a very negative thing, and probably given how down to earth the Talmud is, right, it was probably not like, oh, you're ruining your own soul, right? It probably had in mind a more practical aspect of it. And I'm not sure that I can completely identify it beyond what you said, Phyllis, which I think is very, very wise. All right, so let's go back to the Talmud and we'll review what we learned last time, right, about Rav Safra and that business, right? Because poor Rav Safra, he was so excited. The Gemara reports, right, Rav Safra was a bachelor living in a city. And when the Tana taught this Baraita, the Tana means the guy, meaning Rabbi Yochanan, right, taught this Baraita, right? A Baraita is a non-Mishnaic source, but from the same time, right? So Rabbi Yochanan is a Tana, right? He's one of the Tanaitic period of the rabbis, the early rabbis, who are by and large the ones that are cited in the Mishnah, right? He, according to this narrator, right, there was a time when Rabbi Yochanan actually taught this Braita, right? He was expounding on this, right? And he was expounding on it to whom? To Rabbah and Rav Safra, two of his students, right? And Rav Safra's face lit up with joy. And why? Right? Because he thought, oh, the Holy Blessed One thinks I'm like the bee's knees, right? I'm the best, right? And Rabbah, his study partner or whatever, says to him, sorry, dude, right? This does not actually refer to someone like you. Like the master means like you. Rather, the statement applies to people like Rav Hanina and Rav Oshaya, right, who were cobblers in Eretz Yisrael, and they would sit in the marketplace of prostitutes and fashion shoes for the prostitutes, and the prostitutes would enter their shops and look at them. So the prostitutes would look at the guys. I'm not sure. Does this mean that they were trying to get them to patronize the prostitutes, or I'm assuming that that's what it means. Not completely. Making eyes at them. I like it. Right, making eyes at them. Like, come on, rabbis. Yeah, we know that you're men too. That you're not priests, right? You're not. Of course, there were no Catholic priests at that point, but we know that you're not priests, right? We know that you're rabbis and you're men just like every other man, right? So you're probably interested in what we have on offer. However, due to their piety, these sages did not raise their eyes to look at the women. And those prostitutes were so impressed with that behavior, that when they swore, right, when they made a swear, right, when not like when they said a bad word, right, but when they wanted to swear to something, right, they would say as follows: "We swear by the lives of the holy sages of Eretz Yisrael," right, of the land of Israel. It is this type of bachelor who is praised by heaven. So the regular old bachelor who lives in a city and doesn't bother with the prostitutes, dime a dozen, right? There's plenty of bachelors who don't do that, right? The ones who are really praiseworthy, right, are the ones who actually work for the prostitutes, right? Interact on a daily basis with prostitutes, but treat them what? They treat them like people, right? Treat them like human beings, right? Not like a product, right? But like a person. And so, and the prostitutes themselves can tell the difference. So even though, yes, you could argue, right, that a sex worker without sex isn't working, right, and so that's a problem, right? But these prostitutes seem to understand, right, that being treated as fully human, right, has a value that's beyond the money. You have a question, Marjorie?
No.
Okay. All right. So I went through that kind of fast because we did go over it last week, so I didn't want to belabor it. But any responses to this now, right? That we actually went through the previous section last week. There was so much hubbub about the prostitutes and the rabbis that we went right to that section. Go ahead, Maureen.
So much I'm missing out of the story, such as what is the requirement not to be what's the requirement of treating people beyond the lowest level of human? What I'm trying to say is, okay, they did or it wasn't their responsibility to issue sociological guidelines in which they come from, providing the government help to these victims. It's very somewhat treated so poorly that the government has to look out for sometimes that is it's not read into this. It's not at a point of discussion of the proper one of those victims. Say to what extent
Right. I mean, that's actually really interesting, right? That you're raising the question, right, of why are there prostitutes at all, right? And it's also asking the question, or it's implying the question, well, what is the governance of this community, right? If it was Eretz Yisrael, right, then it was ruled by whom? Not during the in a temporal sense, not in the eternal sense, right? In a temporal sense, right? It's ruled by Rome, right? So who's in charge? Right? The Romans are in charge, right? And most of the Talmud, right? There's a sort of sense that the Jews either live in Babylon, right, where the Babylonians are in charge, or they're living in Eretz Yisrael, right, where the Romans are in charge. And obviously there's Jews all over the place, even at this point, right? There's Jews all over the place, right? But so this is a society, right, where Jews, they interact with non-Jews all the time, right? And B, they're not in charge of the government.
And I can understand why the Jews were upset with the Romans.
Absolutely.
And I mean, up until the Middle Ages, there was references to things like Yoshipandri. You know Yoshipandri?
Oh, okay.
not their art. They took it out of what they took it out of the
Yeah.
literature.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. Yeah. So yeah. So the prostitutes, they may have been Jewish, they may not have been Jewish, right? But but again, there's this is one of those texts, right, where you see that there's this sort of fundamental emphasis on the humanity of all people, even people that you might assume were sort of the lowest of the low. Yeah, go ahead.
Assuming that there were no prostitutes before the Romans came.
I'm not assuming that at all.
Yeah.
No, I'm not assuming
When
that
the
at all.
Jews were in charge, they were undoubtedly prostitutes.
Absolutely, right? And very interesting, right? That and again, the and I think I mentioned this last week, right? Is that that there's on one hand, right? There's the sort of standard religious abhorrence of prostitution, right? In Judaism, right? On the other hand, right? One of our most important biblical heroines disguised herself as a prostitute in order to have a baby who became the ancestor of King David, right? And that's in the Torah, right? So you have to. There's the Judaism really Judaism is really not a black and white religion, right? Despite the fact that there are many black-headed Jews who wear only black and white, right? But it's really a both and kind of religion, right? So that there's a way in which there's a place somehow for everything under the sun, right? Within Judaism, which is not to say it's a good thing, right? But even though prostitution is not necessarily a good thing, right? You have to treat prostitutes the same way you would treat any other woman, right? And so that's that, which is not always. I mean, it's actually not uncommon in the New Testament either, right? That that Jesus is supposed to, he's also supposed to be hanging out with sex workers, right? So it's there's many clergy people, right, who spend a lot of time working with the lowest of the low in society, right? And these are the people who treat them maximally as humans. So, with all the bad stuff that comes with religion, right? There's also that capacity for compassion. All right. Any final thoughts about this little piece?
By way of absolutely nothing.
Yes.
Why is some of the print in boldface and others not?
Oh, that's actually a very good question. The reason is that the text of you can see, right, that the text of the Hebrew, right, is much shorter than the text of the English, right? So part of that is just that there are fewer words in a Hebrew sentence, right? Because of the structure of the language, right? That words that are separate in English are attached to other words in Hebrew, like and all possessive pronouns and all that. The other reason, though, is that the text of the Talmud is very, very compressed and condensed. So, and it takes a lot for granted, right? So what you see in the bold print is the translation of the actual text. The standard, right, plain text is a gloss by Adin Steinsaltz. And so it's one gloss on some people agree with his gloss, other people disagree and think it should be different, but this is the one that's available on the website that I use. So it's the one we get. So if they're wrong, they're wrong, whatever. I mean, the point is that, we're again, we're not necessarily looking for the answer here, right? We're looking to really expand our brain and understand, right, how does the Jewish system work, right? And so we'll do our best.
So what are we going to do next week?
So next week we will. So I had someone made the suggestion last week that we look at Pirkei Avot. So let's go there now, and I will show you the very beginning of Pirkei Avot, and we can decide, yeah, we like it, or nah, do something different. I already gave you money, Safari. I don't need to give you more. Okay. There we go. Okay, so this is the very beginning of Pirkei Avot. Moshe kibel Torah miSinai u'misara liHoshua. Hoshua lizkenim leniviim unviim misaruha la'anshe Knesset Hagadola. And they said three things. All right, so we'll just start with that first verse. Moses received the Torah at Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets, they forgot a word, I think. Second. And the prophets transferred it. They repeated the word there. Transmitted. Sorry, this I should never use. I never want to use Safari because of this reason. You click on it, it does that. Sorry, everybody. All right, I won't make this mistake next time. And the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. And they said three things: be patient in the administration of justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. So one of the parlor games, right, of this is trying, well, what makes these three things into a category? Is there anything that links them? We did this with Rabbi Yochanan, right? We came up with a couple of very nice ideas, right? I had come up with the idea of temptation. You would come up with the idea there's a good and a bad side to these things, right? They're complicated situations, right? So can we do something like, oh, see, this is crazy. All right. This is why I always put it into a Google Doc, and it stays still. It doesn't move around the screen. All right. All right. So what we'll do, right, as part of this, is to really think about, well, what does this mean, right? What does it mean to say that Moses received the Torah at Sinai, and then this great chain of transmission? What does it say about Torah, right? Why these people, right? And is it implying, for instance, that Torah is a great big game of telephone, right? Or on the contrary, right, that these were the guys that could play telephone and come up with the entire chain would be consistent the whole way, right? We know actually that that's not true, right? Because in the Talmud, right, much of the Talmud is taken up with trying to understand that if in the Mishnah it says X, Y, Z, but we have a separate tradition, right? A baraita. We learned what a baraita was before, right? A statement of that era that's not in the Mishnah, and that statement says ZYX. Oh, well, what do we do with that, right? What do we do with that? So we know, right, that we know from our own from the tradition's own empirical experience, right, that it was not a flawless game of telephone. Right? It was a normal game of telephone, right? So we need to figure out, well, which one applies, or generally what the Talmud likes to do is which one applies in which case. So in case A, it's X, Y, Z, but in case B, it's ZYX. Right? That's generally what we do, right? But the point is we recognize, right, that there are differences, right? At the same time as we want to deny, right, that there's been any loss of fidelity along the way.
according to this freewheeling interpretation, how do you reconcile that with fence?
With what?
With fence around the Torah?
Ah, right. Very interesting. Well, and what is a fence around the Torah? Right? What does that even mean? Right? What does that even mean? Which is a great question, right? Generally, in our tradition, a fence around the Torah means that you make extra rules, right? So if you have a rule that you don't want someone to break, right, then you not only outlaw that behavior, you outlaw behavior that might lead a person to that behavior. So a good example is, right, why don't we play musical instruments on Shabbat? Is there really anything against Shabbos that says you can't play an instrument? Right? Playing an instrument is no kind of what we call malacha, no kind of labor, right? Connected to the building of the tabernacle, which is generally how we understand the kinds of work that are disallowed on Shabbat, right? There's, strumming a guitar, you're not building anything, you're just strumming a guitar. Blowing your horn, you're just blowing your horn, right? You're not building anything. But the rabbis say, what if you pop a guitar string and you're tempted to fix it, right? God forbid you fix the guitar, right? Because that would be malacha, right? That would definitely be labor that is prohibited on Shabbat, right? And and it's so you're going through your service, right? You're having a great time singing Lecha Dodi, and the guitar player is waving his arms and smashing his, and all of a sudden he breaks the string, and well, the service can't go on, right, unless he fixes the guitar, right? So of course you could have ways around this, right? You own 3 guitars, and presumably after you break the string on one of them, you'll be a little gentler with the next guitar, right? But that's what a fence around the Torah is, right? Is to make rules such that the rules in the Torah will not be broken. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, question is traveling around my mind about the prophets. And prophets, there's so much just inputted into some of those connections.
Yes.
I'm wondering if on the prophets, how you build a fence around the Torah, not around the prophets, or is that inclusive?
That's a good question. I mean, in what way? One of the things that I learned, I learned this in rabbinical school, but I really sort of internalized it and began to kind of understand it more already in the time of my rabbinate, right? Is the degree to which the prophets really revise the Torah, right? It's a transmission, but also a revision, right, of it. And so in a sense, so it is interesting, right, that I had pointed out, right, that the translation leaves out a word, right, that Moses received the Torah and transmitted it to Joshua, right, and then just as in the Hebrew, right, Joshua to the elders to the prophets, fine, but not the prophets to the men of this great assembly, right? No, the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly, right? So there is by the inclusion of that word, right, that additional little word, right, we have a sense that the prophets and Moses are in one kind of a category, right, and everybody else is in a different kind of a category, right, which makes sense, right, because Moses was called the greatest of the prophets, right? So Moses is a prophet. So everyone who is called a prophet, right, actually has a power of transmission, right, that is somehow different than what the other people are doing, right? So you might say, oh, you're really picking a strings here, Jim, but so that leads to Maury's question, which I don't really have an answer for beyond probably saying that, yeah, probably what we find in the prophetic books, right? We need to give the same kind of care, right, that we find in the Torah text. But it's a complicated question, right? Because they so often are presenting a revision, and sometimes explicitly so, right? Ezekiel often says, this is what the priests do now, right? What was described in Leviticus or in Numbers or in Exodus, right? That was then. This is now, right? And sometimes very often it's very similar, but sometimes it's different. Anyway, I am now late for another meeting, so I'm sorry. I kept you for too long. I apologize. But thank you, everybody. So we'll get back to Pirkei Avot next week. Hi, Connie. Did you just show up?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I sent an email today, and it occurred to me that I should have also called you, but I didn't think to do it until I was already teaching, and so I'm sorry I did not. But I can. You want me to try to give you a call next week earlier to make sure that you remember that it's 3? Connie, you're muted.
Is it only at 3 now every Wednesday?
Only at 3, right? Because, and this might help you remember, it's at 3 because the first seating for dinner over here at Dinesh is at 4. So I can't.
Okay, I'll have to change my physical therapy appointment. That goes to 2:45 to 3:40, 3:15. Well, is this an hour session, yours?
This is 3 to 4, exactly. Usually.
So I could join 15 minutes later?
You could join 15 minutes in, or you could ask her to come 15 minutes early. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Sounds good. If you want to see it, I'll send you the link again for the YouTube.
I'm planning this Shabbat, you're going to be here at 1550?
No, this Shabbat I'll be at 100 Center Street. Do you want to come over?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
But Shavuot, Arthur and I are going to be both with you for the first day of Shavuot.
Perfect.
Okay, when you're here, you're here.
Exactly.
All right, great.
Sounds good.
See you.
Talk to you soon.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.